Ambassador Sarah Chun stood at the massive viewing port of the Galactic Council's flagship, watching Earth's blue marble slowly rotate beneath them. The planet looked peaceful from this distance, but she knew better. 3 days ago, the Zephyrian Empire had launched what they called a disciplinary strike against humanity's homeworld. The attack had been swift and calculated, targeting major population centers with energy weapons that left crystalline scars across entire continents. The crystalline burns stretched across what used to be downtown Tokyo, turning skyscrapers into twisted glass sculptures. Berlin's historical district had been transformed into a field of sparkling debris that caught sunlight like deadly diamonds. The death toll was still climbing, but early estimates suggested over 2 million humans had perished in the span of 6 hours. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her diplomatic uniform, the formal blue fabric feeling heavy against her shoulders. She had served as humanity's representative to the Galactic Council for 12 years, navigating the complex web of interstellar politics with patience and careful diplomacy. The other species respected her measured approach, her willingness to find compromise even in the most heated debates. But today was different. Today, she carried the weight of her entire species' grief and rage. The door to the council chamber hissed open, and Sarah stepped inside. The circular amphitheater stretched out before her, with delegates from 47 different species seated in their specialized atmospheric pods. At the center sat High Chancellor Vordhak, a massive insectoid creature whose compound eyes reflected the chamber's soft lighting like polished obsidian. The Zephyrian delegation occupied the eastern section of the chamber, their reptilian forms draped in ceremonial purple robes that signified their empire's military might. Admiral Kessex, their lead representative, sat with his scaled hands folded calmly in his lap, showing no sign of remorse or concern. Sarah had known Kessex for years. They had worked together on trade agreements, border disputes, and even collaborated on a joint scientific expedition to map the Andromeda Spiral's outer rim. She had considered him a professional colleague, perhaps even a friend. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical wounds inflicted on her homeworld. Chancellor Vordhak's mandibles clicked in the traditional call for order. The emergency session of the Galactic Council is now convened. We gather to address the recent incident involving the human homeworld of Earth and the Zephyrian Empire. Incident. Sarah almost laughed at the clinical terminology. 2 million dead humans reduced to an incident in the Council's official record. Admiral Kessex of the Zephyrian Empire will present their formal statement, the Chancellor announced. Kessex rose to his feet with fluid grace, his yellow eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates. Honored members of the Council, the Zephyrian Empire acted within established galactic law regarding the correction of primitive species. The humans had been repeatedly warned about their aggressive expansion into contested territory. The recent establishment of colonies in the Kepler sector directly violated our territorial claims. Sarah's jaw clenched. The Kepler colonies were agricultural settlements, home to families seeking new opportunities among the stars. The colonists had followed all proper channels, registering their settlements with the Galactic Survey Commission and paying the required fees. The Zephyrians had never filed a formal territorial dispute. The strike against Earth was measured and proportional. Kessex continued, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We targeted only military and industrial sites. Any civilian casualties were regrettable, but unavoidable collateral damage in the enforcement of galactic law. Lies. Every word was a calculated lie. The Zephyrians had deliberately targeted civilian population centers, using weapons specifically designed to maximize casualties while leaving infrastructure intact. The message was clear: submit to our will, or watch your people die. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their pods. The Altarian representative, a crystalline being that communicated through harmonic vibrations, chimed a note of disapproval. The Centauri delegation whispered among themselves, their gray faces showing obvious distress. Furthermore, Kessex said, his tone growing more confident as he sensed the Council's discomfort, the human species has demonstrated concerning aggressive tendencies throughout their short membership in this Council. Their military expansion, their territorial ambitions, their resistance to proper imperial guidance all suggest a dangerous species that requires firm correction. He paused, letting his words settle over the chamber like poison gas. The Zephyrian Empire stands ready to assume administrative control of human space, to provide the guidance and structure this primitive species clearly requires. We ask the Council's formal blessing for this necessary intervention. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Administrative control was diplomatic language for conquest, for the complete subjugation of an entire species. The Zephyrians weren't just justifying their attack on Earth, they were announcing their intention to enslave humanity entirely. Chancellor Vorthack's mandibles clicked rapidly, calling for order. The Council recognizes Ambassador Chun of the human delegation. You may present humanity's response. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber upon her. She had prepared careful remarks, measured words designed to appeal to the Council's sense of justice and law. She had planned to present evidence of Zephyrian aggression, to methodically dismantle their legal justifications, to build a case for sanctions and reparations. But, as she looked out at the assembled delegates, at their uncomfortable expressions and averted gazes, she realized the terrible truth. They were afraid. The Zephyrian Empire commanded the largest fleet in the galaxy, controlled the most advanced weapons technology, and had just demonstrated their willingness to use both against civilian populations. The other species would express their regrets, file their protests, and ultimately do nothing. Her prepared remarks crumbled to ash in her mind. Honored delegates, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber's acoustics. 3 days ago, you witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. Not the attack itself. The galaxy has seen countless wars and conflicts over the millennia. What you witnessed was the first time in over 1,000 years that someone struck Earth. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Several delegates leaned forward in their pods, sensing something different in her tone. You see, Admiral Kesek speaks of territorial disputes and legal justifications. He talks of proportional responses and administrative necessity. But there's something fundamentally important that every species in this chamber needs to understand about humans. Sarah's voice began to strengthen, carrying a note that many of the delegates had never heard from her before. Gone was the careful diplomat, the measured negotiator who sought compromise at every turn. In her place stood something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous. We don't just live on Earth, she said, her words cutting through the chamber's silence like a blade. We are Earth. Every human carries within them the genetic memory of 10 million years of evolution on that world. We remember when our ancestors fought saber-toothed cats with nothing but sharpened sticks. We remember the ice ages that should have killed us, the volcanoes that should have buried us, the asteroid impacts that should have erased us from existence. The chamber had gone completely silent. Even the usual background hum of life support systems seemed muted. Earth made us what we are. It taught us that survival isn't just about being strong, it's about being stubborn. It's about refusing to give up, even when every rational calculation says you should. It's about looking at impossible odds and saying we'll see about that. Sarah's eyes found Admiral Kessex across the chamber. The reptilian's yellow gaze met hers, and, for the first time since the attack began, she saw uncertainty flicker across his features. You struck our home, Admiral. You killed our people on the world that made us who we are. And now you stand before this council expecting us to submit, to accept your guidance, to bow our heads, and accept our place as your subjects. She smiled then, and several delegates actually recoiled from the expression. It wasn't a diplomatic smile, wasn't the careful expression of a career negotiator. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of prey. But here's what you don't understand about humans, what none of you understand. We've never been the strongest species in the galaxy. We're not the fastest, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. But we have one quality that no other species in this chamber possesses. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical presence in the room. We are absolutely, completely, utterly insane when someone hurts our family. Sarah turned to address the full council, her voice rising with each word. The Zephyrian Empire believes they can cow humanity into submission with a show of force. They think that by demonstrating their superior firepower, they can convince us to accept their rule. What they don't realize is that they've just made the greatest tactical error in galactic history. Admiral Kessex rose from his seat, his voice sharp with authority. Ambassador Chun, you forget yourself. The Zephyrian Empire commands a fleet of 12,000 warships. Your entire species barely maintains 300 vessels. You speak of defiance, but mathematics does not lie. Sarah's smile grew wider. Admiral, you're absolutely right. We can't match your fleet ship for ship. We can't win a conventional war against the Zephyrian Empire. In any rational analysis, we should surrender immediately and hope for lenient treatment. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried across the chamber with the force of absolute conviction. But we're not going to do that, because you made one crucial mistake when you planned your attack on Earth. You assumed that humans think like rational beings. You assumed that we would calculate the odds, recognize our disadvantages, and make the logical choice. The chamber erupted as several delegates began speaking at once, their voices mixing into a cacophony of alarm and disbelief. Chancellor Vorthack's mandibles clicked frantically as he called for order. Sarah continued speaking over the noise, her voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. What you don't understand is that humans stopped being rational the moment we watched our children die in crystalline fire. Logic died when we saw Berlin turn to glass. Calculation ended when Tokyo's towers melted into abstract art. The noise gradually died as her words sank in. The assembled delegates stared at her with expressions ranging from fascination to horror. So let me be perfectly clear about what's going to happen now. Humanity rejects the Zephyrian Empire's demand for submission. We will not bow. We will not surrender. We will not accept administrative control or guidance or any other euphemism for slavery. Admiral Kessex's scales rippled with what Sarah recognized as suppressed rage. And what exactly do you think 300 ships can accomplish against the might of the Empire? Sarah turned to face him directly, and for a moment the chamber might have been empty except for the two of them. We're going to do what humans have always done when someone tries to destroy us, Admiral. We're going to adapt. We're going to improvise. We're going to find ways to hurt you that you never imagined possible. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the chamber's perfect acoustics, every word carried clearly to every delegate. And we're going to teach the galaxy exactly why Earth spent 4 billion years trying to kill us, and why we're still here despite its best efforts. 6 months after Sarah Chin's declaration before the Galactic Council, the war was not going as anyone had expected. Admiral Kessex stood in the command center of the Zephyrian dreadnought Eternal Dominion, staring at tactical displays that made no rational sense. The humans should have been extinct by now. Every military analyst in the Empire had run the calculations, and the results were always the same. The Zephyrian fleet outnumbered human forces 40-1. Their weapons technology was 3 generations more advanced. Their ships were faster, better armored, and supported by a supply chain that spanned half the galaxy. Yet somehow, impossibly, the humans were winning. The latest reports painted a picture that defied everything Kessex understood about warfare. The human fleet hadn't engaged in a single major battle since the war began. Instead, they had simply vanished into the vast emptiness between stars, leaving behind only empty shipyards and evacuated colonies. For the first month, Kessex had assumed this was simply a strategic withdrawal. The humans were buying time, perhaps hoping that other species would intervene on their behalf. He had been content to let them run while consolidating control over their abandoned territories. But the humans hadn't been running. They had been learning. "Sir," reported Commander Yelex from the communications station, her voice tight, with barely controlled panic. "Another supply convoy has gone missing in the Vega system. That's the 15th this month." Kessex's claws scraped against the metal of his command chair. Supply convoys weren't supposed to disappear in secured space. The Vega system had been under Zephyrian control for over 2 centuries, protected by automated defense platforms and regular patrol schedules. "Any debris? Distress signals? Sensor readings?" he demanded. "Nothing, sir. The convoy was scheduled to arrive at Vega Prime 6 hours ago. When they failed to report in, we sent a reconnaissance ship. They found empty space where the convoy should have been. Empty space. 15 convoys, carrying everything from ammunition to medical supplies to fresh food for the occupation forces. had simply vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no survivors, no evidence they had ever existed. The door to the command center slid open, and Intelligence Director Thesek glided in on her serpentine lower body. Her scaled features were grim as she approached Kessex's chair. "Admiral, I have the analysis you requested on the missing convoys," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she used when delivering bad news. "Report," Kessex ordered. All 15 convoys disappeared at different points along their routes, but they share several common factors. First, they all vanished during routine hyperspace jumps between systems. Second, each convoy was traveling along routes that have been used safely for decades. Third, none of them had any contact with human forces prior to their disappearance. Kessex frowned. "You're suggesting the humans have developed some new form of hyperspace interdiction technology?" "That was my initial hypothesis," Thesek replied. "But our technical analysis suggests otherwise. Human hyperspace technology is still based on the same principles they learned from us when they joined the Galactic Council. They lack both the theoretical knowledge and industrial capacity to develop interdiction systems. Then, how are they making our ships disappear?" Thesek's tongue flicked out nervously, a gesture Kessex recognized as extreme anxiety in her species. "Admiral, we need to consider the possibility that the convoys aren't disappearing. We need to consider the possibility that they're being taken." The command center fell silent. Every officer within hearing range turned to stare at the intelligence director, their faces showing mixtures of confusion and disbelief. "Taken," Kessex repeated. "You mean captured?" "Not captured, sir. Stolen. Entire convoys, ships and crew and cargo, simply relocated." Kessex felt a cold chill run down his spine. "That's impossible. Even if the humans could somehow intercept ships in hyperspace, where would they take them? We've surveyed their entire territory. They don't have the infrastructure to hide 15 military convoys." "That's just it, sir," Thesek said quietly. "We haven't surveyed their entire territory. We've surveyed the territory they showed us." The implications hit Kessex like a physical blow. The humans had been members of the Galactic Council for over a century. During that time, they had submitted detailed surveys of their space, registered all their colonies and installations, and opened their territory to regular inspections. The Zephyrian Empire knew the location of every human world, every orbital station, every asteroid mining operation. Or so they had believed. "Sir," another voice called from across the command center. "Priority message from the Fifth Fleet. Admiral Gorvex reports that the Kepler agricultural colonies are gone." Kessex's head snapped up. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" The communications officer's hands trembled as he read from his display. "The entire population, sir. All 17 colonies in the Kepler sector. Admiral Gorvex's forces arrived to establish occupation, but they found empty settlements. No people, no equipment, no ships. Just abandoned buildings and empty landing pads." "How many people?" Kessex asked, though he dreaded the answer. 8.7 million humans, sir. They evacuated 8.7 million people without our sensors detecting a single ship movement. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 8.7 million people didn't just vanish. Moving that many civilians required massive transport ships, multiple trips, careful coordination. The logistical footprint should have been visible from halfway across the galaxy. But, somehow, the humans had made it all disappear. Director Thesek moved closer to Kessex's chair, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Admiral, there's something else. Something we discovered in the intelligence analysis from the abandoned colonies." "What?" "They left messages, sir. Carved into walls, written in the dirt, painted on buildings. All the same phrase, repeated hundreds of times across all 17 colonies." Kessex waited, knowing he wouldn't like what came next. They wrote, "We remember Earth," in 43 different human languages. Before Kessex could respond, alarms began screaming throughout the command center. Red lights flashed as the ship's automated defense systems activated, and the deck plates vibrated with the sudden acceleration of emergency maneuvers. "Contact!" shouted the sensor operator. Multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace, bearing 0 Mark 77. Kessex spun toward the main display, where tactical icons were materializing like angry red stars. But something was wrong with the sensor readings. The ships appeared to be human designs, but they were larger than anything in the human fleet database. Classification, Kessex demanded. Unknown, sir. The computer can't match these designs to any known human vessels. They're using human reactor signatures and human communication protocols, but the hulls they're enormous. Kessex stared at the display as more ships continued to appear. 12 contacts, then 20, then 30. Each one was massive, easily 3 times the size of a standard human cruiser. Where did they get ships that large? He whispered. The answer came from the communications station, where an officer was frantically trying to decode incoming transmissions. Sir, I'm picking up identification codes from the approaching fleet. They're broadcasting registry numbers for ships that were reported destroyed months ago. That's impossible. We confirmed those kills ourselves. Sir, one of them is transmitting the registry for the US Defiance. That ship was destroyed in the first week of the war. I watched the tactical recordings myself. Kessex's claws dug furrows in his chair's armrest. The US Defiance had been humanity's flagship, a heavy cruiser that had fought valiantly before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The Zephyrian Task Force had fired over 300 missiles at the ship before it finally died in a brilliant explosion that lit up half a solar system. Yet somehow, it was broadcasting from one of the approaching vessels. Admiral, the sensor operator called, his voice cracking with stress. The approaching ships are launching fighters. Launching a lot of fighters. The tactical display exploded with new contacts as thousands of small craft poured from the human fleet. But these weren't the sleek interceptors humanity had used before the war. These were something else entirely angular, brutal-looking vessels that moved with predatory grace. Fighter classification? Kessex asked. Unknown, sir. Computer has no match for these designs either. Director Thesek moved to stand beside Kessex, studying the tactical display with obvious fascination. Admiral, look at the construction patterns on those ships. The hull geometry, the engine placement, the weapon mounts. Kessex looked, and his blood turned to ice. The human ships were built from Zephyrian components. Engine sections that matched destroyed Imperial cruisers. Weapon arrays that belonged to missing destroyers. Hull plates that had once protected supply convoys. They didn't steal our ships, he said in horrified realization. They stole our ships and turned them into something else. The communication system crackled to life, and a human voice filled the command center. But this wasn't the measured tones of Ambassador Chun or the formal protocols of military communication. This was something primal, something that spoke to instincts millions of years older than civilization. Eternal Dominion. This is Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding the Terran Resistance Fleet. You have 30 seconds to surrender your vessel and prepare to be boarded. Kessex nearly laughed despite the circumstances. 30 seconds? With 30 ships against our entire battle group. Chin's voice continued, and now Kessex could hear something that made his scales crawl with ancestral fear. You killed our children on Earth, Admiral Kessex. You burned our cities and turned our world into a monument to your empire's cruelty. Did you really think we would simply forget? The human fighters were spreading out now, forming attack formations that defied conventional tactical doctrine. They moved like a swarm of predators, each ship acting independently, yet somehow coordinated with the others. You wanted to see what humans are capable of when someone hurts our family, Chin's voice said, now carrying notes of something that sounded almost like joy. You wanted to test our resolve, to see if we would submit to superior force. The first wave of human fighters reached the Zephyrian formation's outer perimeter, and what happened next would be discussed in military academies for generations. The fighters didn't engage in conventional dogfights or attempt to overwhelm the Zephyrian defenses through sheer numbers. Instead, they did something impossible. Each fighter targeted a specific system on the Zephyrian ship's engines, weapons, sensors, life support. But instead of destroying these systems, they somehow hijacked them. Zephyrian weapons turned on their own ships. Engines fired in directions that sent vessels spinning out of control. Sensor arrays began broadcasting false information throughout the Imperial fleet. What's happening? Kessex shouted over the chaos of alarms and status reports. How are they doing this? Director Thesek was staring at the tactical display with an expression of dawning horror. They learned our systems, Admiral. Every ship they stole, every convoy they captured, every piece of equipment they took, it wasn't just theft. It was education. The Zephyrian fleet was tearing itself apart. Ship after ship fell victim to its own compromised systems, turning weapons on allies or careening into nearby vessels. The humans hadn't even used their main guns yet, and half the Imperial task force was already disabled. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos one final time, and now there was no mistaking the emotion behind her words. It was the voice of Earth itself, of a world that had spent 4 billion years perfecting the art of survival against impossible odds. Welcome to humanity's first lesson in asymmetric warfare, Admiral. We hope you survive long enough to appreciate the education. 1 year after the war began, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session aboard the neutral station of Haven Point. Representatives from every major species filled the chamber, but this time the seating arrangements told a very different story than they had 12 months earlier. The Zephyrian delegation sat in the defendants section, their once proud purple robes replaced by simple gray uniforms that marked them as a species under council investigation. Admiral Kessex was notably absent, having been captured 3 months earlier when the humans somehow infiltrated his personal command ship while it was in hyperspace. Chancellor Vorthack's compound eyes surveyed the assembly with visible agitation. In his 150 years of service to the Council, he had never witnessed such a complete reversal of galactic power dynamics. The species that had been dismissed as primitive and easily controlled had somehow managed to bring the galaxy's greatest military empire to its knees. The Council recognizes Fleet Admiral Sarah Chun, the Chancellor announced, his mandibles clicking with formal protocol. Sarah rose from her seat in the center of the chamber. She wore the same diplomatic uniform she had worn a year ago, but everything else about her had changed. The careful diplomat had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority, someone who had learned to command not through political maneuvering but through victory after impossible victory. Honored delegates, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. 1 year ago, I stood in this chamber and told you that humanity would not submit to the Zephyrian Empire's demands. Many of you believed that we were making a noble but ultimately futile gesture. She paused, looking around the chamber at faces that showed expressions ranging from awe to terror. I want to take a moment to review what has happened since then, because I think it's important that everyone in this chamber understands exactly what humanity has accomplished. The main display activated, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Red zones marked territory that had been under Zephyrian control at the start of the war. As Sarah spoke, the red zones began shifting to blue. In the first 6 months, humanity captured or destroyed over 4,000 Zephyrian vessels. We did this not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through what our military specialists call adaptive combat doctrine. We studied your ships, learned your systems, and then used that knowledge against you. The Altarian representative, a crystalline being named Resonance of Truth, chimed a harmonic question. Sarah's translation implant converted the musical tones into words. How did such a small fleet accomplish such overwhelming victories? Sarah smiled, and several delegates shifted uncomfortably. They had learned to fear that smile over the past year. The answer is simple, Resonance of Truth. We cheated. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. Cheating was a concept that didn't translate well across species lines. What humans considered creative problem-solving, other species often viewed as incomprehensible rule-breaking. Let me explain, Sarah continued. The Zephyrian Empire, like most galactic civilizations, approaches warfare with certain assumptions. You assume that ships fight ships. You assume that battles happen in designated spaces. You assume that there are rules that everyone will follow. She gestured to the display, where tactical recordings began playing. The assembled delegates watched in fascination as human fighters performed maneuvers that defied physics, ships appeared in impossible locations, and entire fleets seemed to materialize from empty space. Humans don't share those assumptions. When we found ourselves facing impossible odds, we did what we've always done throughout our history. We changed the rules. Director Thesek, representing what remained of the Zephyrian delegation, rose to speak. Admiral Chun, we demand an explanation for how your forces were able to breach our security systems. The technology you displayed violates fundamental principles of physics. Sarah's smile grew wider. Director Thesek, there's your first mistake. You're assuming we use technology. The chamber fell silent as delegates tried to process this statement. Warfare without technology was a concept that most galactic species had abandoned millennia ago. You see, Sarah continued, when the Zephyrian Empire first attacked Earth, they made a critical error in their targeting priorities. They focused on our cities, our infrastructure, our population centers. But they ignored our universities. She paused, letting this information sink in. Earth's universities contain something that no other world in the galaxy possesses: 40,000 years of accumulated human knowledge about creative problem-solving. We have entire fields of study dedicated to thinking outside conventional parameters, philosophy departments that specialize in questioning fundamental assumptions, engineering programs that teach students to build solutions using whatever materials happen to be available. The Centauri representative, Ambassador Velkarn, leaned forward in his atmospheric pod. Are you saying that your victories were achieved through academic research? I'm saying that humanity's greatest weapon isn't our technology or our military strength, Sarah replied. It's our absolute refusal to accept that problems have only one solution. She gestured to the display again, where new images appeared showing Zephyrian ships that had been captured intact, their crews mysteriously absent, but unharmed. Take our infiltration techniques, for example. The Zephyrian Empire assumed that boarding a ship required either superior firepower or advanced teleportation technology. But our xenoanthropologists reminded us that every species has cultural blind spots, patterns of behavior that are so fundamental to their worldview that they never question them. Director Thesek's scales rippled with agitation. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Zephyrian military doctrine has a fatal flaw. It assumes that enemies will behave rationally. Your security protocols are designed to detect weapons, to prevent unauthorized access, to stop conventional infiltration attempts. But they're not designed to stop someone from simply walking aboard your ship and asking politely to speak with the captain. The chamber erupted in shocked exclamations. The idea of infiltrating a military vessel through simple social interaction was so alien to most species that they literally couldn't process it. Our cultural anthropologists identified 17 different psychological vulnerabilities in Zephyrian social conditioning. Sarah continued over the noise. Your species has such a rigid hierarchy that lower-ranking individuals will obey almost any order that appears to come from superior authority. Your military training emphasizes following protocol so heavily that your officers become paralyzed when faced with situations that aren't covered in their manuals. She turned to face Director Thesek directly. Do you know how many of your ships we captured simply by having someone in a convincing uniform show up at the airlock with official-looking paperwork? Thesek's silence was answer enough. Chancellor Vordhak clicked his mandibles for order. Admiral Chun, the Council is prepared to hear humanity's terms for ending this conflict. Sarah shook her head. Chancellor, with respect, you misunderstand the situation. The conflict is already over. The Zephyrian Empire ceased to exist as a military threat 6 months ago. What we're here to discuss is what comes next. She activated a new display showing the current state of the galaxy. The red zones marking Zephyrian territory had been replaced by a patchwork of colors representing the various species that had reclaimed their independence. Over the past year, humanity has liberated 43 different worlds that were under Zephyrian occupation. We've freed 6 different species from Imperial control and returned their stolen resources. We've captured or destroyed 90% of the Zephyrian fleet. The numbers were staggering. The Zephyrian Empire had controlled nearly a quarter of the galaxy's inhabited systems. Their defeat represented the largest shift in galactic power in over 1,000 years. But here's what's really important, Sarah continued. We didn't do this to build our own empire. Every liberated world has been given a choice. Join a new alliance based on mutual cooperation, or maintain complete independence with guaranteed protection from future aggression. Director Thesek finally found her voice. What about the Zephyrian people? What about our worlds, our population centers? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Director, humanity has no interest in revenge against your civilians. Every Zephyrian world that has surrendered peacefully has been allowed to maintain self-governance under council oversight. Your people are free to rebuild their society however they choose, as long as they agree to abide by certain basic principles regarding the treatment of other species. She paused, then added, "Of course, your military leaders who authorized the attack on Earth will face trial for crimes against civilian populations. But that's a matter for the Council's justice system, not for human revenge." Ambassador Velkarn spoke up again. "Admiral Chan, the Council is curious about humanity's intentions going forward. Your species has demonstrated military capabilities that exceed anything in our historical records. What assurance can you give us that humanity will not become the next galactic empire?" Sarah looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had watched her species transform from diplomatic supplicants to the galaxy's dominant military force in just 12 months. "Ambassador, let me tell you something about human psychology that I don't think any of you really understand. We don't want to rule the galaxy. We never did. What we wanted was to explore, to learn, to build peaceful relationships with our neighbors among the stars." Her voice began to carry the same dangerous edge that had terrified the chamber a year earlier. "But then, someone decided to test our resolve. Someone decided to see what would happen if they hurt our family. And now you've all learned exactly what humans are capable of when we're properly motivated." She stood and walked to the center of the chamber, her presence somehow seeming to fill the entire space. "So here's humanity's proposal for the future. We want to establish a new galactic alliance based on cooperation rather than domination. Member species will retain complete sovereignty over their internal affairs. Disputes will be resolved through negotiation and arbitration rather than military force. And any species that attempts to conquest or genocide will face the combined response of all alliance members." The chamber was completely silent as delegates absorbed this proposal. Sarah continued, "Of course, participation in this alliance is completely voluntary. Any species that prefers the old system of imperial dominance and military conquest is free to pursue that path." She smiled again, and several delegates actually flinched. "Of course, they'll be doing so knowing that humanity exists, and that we've spent the last year developing new techniques for dealing with aggressive neighbors." Chancellor Vorthack's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed the implications. "Admiral Chan, are you suggesting that humanity would intervene in future conflicts throughout the galaxy?" "Chancellor, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you exactly what's going to happen. Humanity spent centuries dreaming about joining a galactic community based on peace and mutual respect. When that dream was threatened, we demonstrated exactly how far we're willing to go to protect it." She returned to her seat, but her voice carried clearly throughout the chamber. "The choice is yours, honored delegates. You can help us build the kind of galaxy we all dreamed of when we first reached for the stars. Or you can test our resolve and discover what new innovations human creativity can produce when properly motivated." Director Thesek rose one final time, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we refuse? What if some species choose to maintain the old ways?" Sarah's answer chilled every delegate in the chamber. "Director, I hope for their sake that no one is foolish enough to make that choice. Because if the last year has taught us anything, it's that humanity gets very creative when someone threatens our family. And now, every peaceful species in this galaxy is part of that family." The vote was unanimous. The Terran Alliance was formally established 3 hours later, with 37 founding members and a waiting list that included every remaining species in the galaxy. And in the deepest archives of the Alliance's new headquarters, human scientists continued their research into creative problem-solving, just in case anyone ever forgot the lesson of what happens when you strike humanity's home.